Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you're listening to another episode of Data Nation. And here I want to cover the second sort of big announcement of the week. And that is the fact that Databricks has purchased Tabular. Okay, this is fairly earth-shattering news for a variety of reasons. And there's a lot of different ways you can look at it, so we're going to break it down. Okay, so if you've been listening to my podcast for any bit, you know there's sort of like this sort of, I wouldn't call it a war, but it's a war, the table format war, in the sense that basically there's three main table formats. That's Apache Iceberg, Delta Lake, and Apache Hoodie. They're all ways for you to recognize your tables on your data lake. And there's different companies that have like placed their bets, because at the end of the day, when you're creating tools, you want to give your users sort of first-class support, and you can't give people first-class support for everything. So you have to kind of like prioritize, like, hey, which formats am I going to really support? What things am I going to connect to? All these kinds of things. So there's been sort of pressure in all three camps to, increase adoption of that format. And then, basically, mostly it's been sort of a battle of just trying to create. Really, what oftentimes happens, a lot of people take the approach of creating uncertainty. Okay, so they say to you like, hey, choose this format because there's all these X factors with formats B and C. Okay, and that's kind of gone on for pretty much as long as I've been around this space. Okay, some of my first content that I put out there was sort of actually kind of in that vein, like really just comparing the different formats. Over time, I've kind of I feel more sort of, at the end of the day, like they'll work. I do feel very confident that Apache Iceberg is sort of where I think, serves most people's use cases the best. And I think that's evidenced by if it's architecture and whatnot. So I definitely have an opinion on the thing, and anyone who's followed me long enough knows my opinion. I mean, I wrote Apache Iceberg, the definitive guide. So I definitely have an opinion. So, but the point being is that this has been conflict. So it's what you wouldn't expect is that Databricks, the company behind Delta Lake, one of those three formats, okay, who's basically, when you're a business, okay, and you build a business on open source, and in this case, Databricks was sort of built on top of Apache Spark. Oftentimes you try to find other avenues to create sort of like a differentiating feature, something that's sort of unique to your platform, to provide some sort of reason for people to pay you for your services. Okay, and so part of that was initially a Delta Lake, this sort of table format that allowed you to have data lake tables. And eventually that got open source, because generally, again, there's always the pressure to open source, because at the end of the day, when it comes to things like people's data, people have been on the wrong end of having to do data migrations over and over again from every time there's a new system or a new hot thing. And migrations tend to be really expensive. So any money you've theoretically saved by using whatever you were using before, you've kind of lost in the migration. So people get really wary. So they want open. Okay, the reason they want open is because they want to minimize those migration frictions in the future. You're not having to switch at the drop of a hat or do a major shift to take advantage of whatever sort of the necessary tools are of the day. So Delta Lake's open sourced. For the most part, still the way the direction of the project, how the, who's actually writing the code, what features they're adding, still very much a Databricks influenced project, but you can see the source code and theoretically make contributions. Especially when it comes to the project's other language API. So if you're talking about Delta Rust or basically everything except the core Delta Lake project, yeah, there's actually a decent amount of contributors, usually just re-implementing features that already exist in sort of the main core Delta Lake project. So, which is what determines really sort of the feature sets that get produced. So you have that, and then you have Iceberg, which is sort of not really controlled by any particular company. I guess the company that has the strongest claim would have been Tabular, because Tabular is founded by the creators of Iceberg. Because again, Iceberg was created out of Netflix. Okay, basically by and that is the founders of Tabular, which includes Ryan Blue, Dan Weeks and Jason Reed, all who were part of those early days before it was even called Apache Iceberg, in the days over there at Netflix. Okay, and they started this company where they took a lot of the practices that they used to sort of optimize Netflix's data and turned it into a service. That is the business that is Tabular. Okay, basically the idea to build some sort of enterprise catalog that people who want to build a Iceberg data lakehouse and want enterprise level features can use, that's agnostic to sort of the compute tool that they want to use. And the company was only around for like a couple years, but here they are. They got purchased for like $1 billion. Now, again, when you hear $1 billion, that may be the nominal value of the transaction, but you got to keep in mind that chances are probably a lot of the money, that value is in the value of probably equity. I don't know how much of the deal is cash. Again, the details of the deal I don't think are public because Databricks isn't a public company. So it could end up being worth more or less, because if they got paid a good chunk in equity, okay, it's a liquid, so they're not rich yet, but chances are if Databricks were to go public someday, it's probably worth more than it was valued at the time of the purchase. So in that case, it might be multi-billion dollars. But it would probably be a good chunk of equity that was given to them, or they were given cash. In that case, they're rich, and probably a mix of the two. Okay, they might have gotten like $500 million in cash and $500 million in equity in Databricks, and not a bad deal. Okay, overall, whatever the deal was, okay, everyone at Tabular is in a good place. Let's just put it that way. And good for them. They definitely earned it. They built a cool thing. They innovated. They had a vision. They executed and were rewarded for it. But a lot of the tension comes in. Well, but basically now Databricks doesn't only own Tabular. They now technically have the creators of Iceberg under their employ, who also are make up. In the case of Ryan Blue, is the chair of the PMC. Okay, and a PMC is the what's the exact term? It's basically the PMC, essentially think of it as like the board of directors for an open source Apache project. The actual the actual term for what the letters mean, C is for committee, but the rest is sort of escaping me at the moment. Or I think it's like project management committee. But basically, so that's the thing. So the point is, like, Databricks just purchased a good chunk of influence over the Iceberg project. So that's really interesting. But I think there's a couple different ways you can look at it. Some people look at it from Databricks' point of view, from the point of view that Databricks is capitulating and basically admitting that Apache Iceberg is the winner. Okay, I mean, you take a look at the Polaris announcement from Snowflake. So you have Snowflake basically going all in on Iceberg and basically really sort of declaring that, okay, it's time to go from really being a data warehouse to being a data lakehouse company. And then you have a Databricks, who's a data lakehouse company, who's but in the Delta Lake camp, really saying, okay, well, we need to also be an Iceberg company. Okay, and just to be fair, to point out, who's been a data lake house company and an Iceberg company all along, who's realized both these things early on and has committed fully to it? Well, us at Dremio. Okay, so I mean, now the world is kind of coming to the conclusion that we came to years ago. And, our solution is pretty tailored to that world. So overall, the last 24 hours has been very validating to sort of, what's being built at Dremio. But again, you can take a look at this as like a capitulation of Iceberg, of Iceberg winning the table format wars. Another framing, like if you read the blog by Ryan Blue, talking about sort of his point of view, his idea is that, hey, by joining forces, they can create a product that facilitates both formats and creates certainty that both formats will have a place. And basically, by getting rid of that certainty, more people can adopt either format, because a lot of people are waiting for a winner before they actually act and adopt. So if anything, this might create the impetus for people to be more comfortable adopting. True, but what'll probably happen, and I think it's pretty much, I think in the Databricks announcement, they kind of discussed this, so that like the Tabular team will be working on creating a lot of that Iceberg functionality and taking a lot of their functionality and adding it to the Unity catalog. Unity catalog is not open source. I mean, who knows? Databricks' event next week, maybe they'll shock everyone and announce it's open source. If that's the case, then I'll react at that point and say what my thoughts on that would be. But at least as far as I can tell right now, Unity is going to stay closed sourced, because that's essentially becomes their pull. You put your data, you track your tables, in this case, whether they're Iceberg, Hoodie, or Delta Lake at this point. And you would track them with Unity catalog, and you'd set up all your governance rules in Unity catalog, and basically how your data is governed becomes your governance becomes portable, and that becomes a thing. Like, hey, you use Databricks because you want to have that Unity catalog. And then Snowflake, doing the same thing with Polaris. And again, I talked about, in which again, Nestle's been trying to also be that in that catalog where it makes these kind of things portable, but Nestle and Polaris are open source. So basically, if you want those governance features that these catalogs have, you could stand up your own catalog. And I do think there's a value to that, as I discussed in the previous episode. Okay, so I mean, but that's, so the thing is like, so yeah, there's certainty, but does it require sort of like a single proprietary platform to provide that certainty? And at that point, did we lose the whole point of kind of having a diverse ecosystem? Not really worried about that, because the Apache Iceberg community is like, it's not like Tabular. The people from Tabular add up to about 30%. They're essentially the vast majority of the commits to the Apache Iceberg project. But again, even then, they're not a majority of the commits. So the point is, like, Iceberg has enough people who spend time developing in it that you could lose, we're not necessarily losing that, but you could theoretically lose a large player and the project would still survive. And that's the beauty of Apache projects. They have to kind of maintain that kind of level of committer diversity, so that way they just perpetually live on. Okay, which is why the Apache brand name is so important, because you have to earn that name. You have to earn putting Apache next to your project's name by going through these hoops that really protect the sustainability of the project. So pretty comfortable that Iceberg's not going anywhere. But again, you can take a look at it as Iceberg winning, or as it trying to eliminate the uncertainty in it, or basically trying to build, basically Databricks going more all in on Unity catalog as their product, less so than Delta Lake. Okay, basically saying, okay, hey, we're still going to develop Delta Lake, but at the end of the day, what we want is people to govern their data through this catalog, so that way they have to kind of come through us in some shape or manner most of the time. And then again, once you're in their platform, even if it's just to use the catalog, you're eventually going to use their other services, which makes sense. So it's an interesting play. But I mean, regardless of how you look at it, the main thing you can take away is that Iceberg's momentum has only accelerated quite a bit, because as I mentioned during the Polaris announcement, like, again, Iceberg had its really first, like, really big come to, sort of big moment in that limelight the first time that Snowflake announced that they were going to support Iceberg. And part of that, I mean, obviously Snowflake got behind Iceberg partly to contrast against Databricks' support for Delta Lake. Okay, so this, this whole tit for tat. But when you have the two biggest players currently in the game, not fighting over which format, but fighting over who can sort of claim the most influence in the Iceberg space, it just basically shows how important Iceberg is and sort of where Iceberg is positioned at the moment, where, it's pretty easy to kind of see it. It is the standard. It won. Not that Delta Lake or Hoodie are going anywhere, but Iceberg is the one that people are fighting over. So that's pretty cool. Again, me, I am a big proponent of, open table, open catalog, no vendor lock-in. So that means, using Apache Iceberg with an open source catalog, which could be Nessie or Polaris or Grafitino, and just having the sort of like, basically your data is, under your control. It's not owned by the people who are doing your compute. For example, even if you're using like a hosted Nessie, or Polaris, so basically, there'll be a managed version of Polaris that's managed by Snowflake, and there is a managed version of Nessie that Dremio runs in Dremio Cloud. Even then, again, you could easily just move all that over to, the open source version of it. Okay, like that's the beauty of it. And again, the beauty of the way Iceberg catalogs work, like the Nessie project, they actually did create a catalog migration tool. So theoretically, even if you were using a proprietary Apache Iceberg catalog, it wouldn't be too hard to migrate. Again, just the beauty of how Iceberg works, because the majority of what's there is technically just files in your storage. But overall, this makes me very optimistic for the future of Iceberg. Makes me optimistic for the future of Dremio, because again, Dremio has been in the position of being Iceberg first, data lakehouse first, well before pretty much everybody else, who's now sort of coming around to sort of what we've known for a long time. So overall, it is a good week, and especially like being in the position that I am in, where I spend a lot of time talking about Iceberg, creating content around Iceberg. The last 24 hours have definitely been interesting. Seeing a surge of interest in the stats on my content and just the interest in the topic. So overall, yeah, it's good stuff. But hopefully this gives you some information. Overall, at the end of the day, like both Snowflake and Databricks now have an Iceberg story, or a stronger Iceberg story. But they're not the only Iceberg stories. There's a lot of players. There's Upsolver with what they've done recently with Iceberg. Dremio, what we've been doing with Iceberg for years. Pretty much anybody who's doing anything data lakehouse has an Iceberg story now. And the one thing that is clear is that it's a good thing to have an Iceberg story. And that's a good thing. So I'll see you all later. Talk to you. This is Alex. I'll see you then.